this chapter all about the Constitution. So we've learned about, the plan for this new government, how they wrote things down as far as we're going to have 3 branches and a 2-house Congress and all those different things, checks and balances. We have talked about the different arguments over the Constitution, the eventual addition of a Bill of Rights and all of that. But the thing is, what we must remember is that the Constitution, was and was then words on paper. So there were still plenty of questions about what this government was actually going to look like, how it was going to work, what kind of powers different parts of the government were going to use, not use, how they were going to carve out a niche for themselves, how are they going to really establish what their roles and their powers were. Because while the Constitution is rather specific about some things, there are also plenty of things where it's not specific at all. And also things where maybe it might look specific to some, but other people will interpret it differently. There's just a wide variety of gray areas, of places where things are open to interpretation. And so a lot of how the government works, how the government functions, how the president functions, so forth and so on, may not necessarily come from what the Constitution actually says. It may come from how the first people that held those offices interpreted those things. And it has been shaped and changed and molded over time as well. So this is a pivotal moment, not just to see, does the Constitution work, but how is it really going to look like when it's actually a living and breathing and functioning government and not just words on paper. And we'll be looking at, this the chapter title you notice here, Launching a New Nation, Beginning a New Nation. We're going to be covering really a wide span of time in this particular chapter. We will start by looking at the Washington administration, which we'll look at for the rest of this week. Very pivotal administration, obviously, since it is the first one, and they are going to set the tone for so many things, many of which they set the tone for, until now. Others not quite so much. Then we'll look at, really it's the first sort of phase, what we call the early republic. We'll look at Adams, eventually into the Jefferson presidency, and this chapter will conclude with the War of 1812, which kind of marks a turning point in a lot of different things. So we're going to be covering a pretty wide span of time here. So again, the Constitution is ratified in 1789 and goes into effect. So we have to set up this first, presidential administration, first time we've had a president. And of course, who was selected as the first president? Of course, George Washington. Why do you think people wanted Washington as president? Yes?
It was sort of a symbol of American freedom because he was the main general in the Revolution.
Yeah, he himself is kind of symbolic of American freedom, that he commanded the Continental Army. And Washington also, in addition to being probably, the quintessential hero of the time, the celebrity of the time and all of that, and this was kind of mentioned in that video we watched a few days ago, that, even after his exploits in the Revolution, he didn't attempt to seize power. He's never been one to kind of seek power, or at least not appear to be seeking power. And so a lot of folks might have seen him as someone that could be trusted with power, that could be trusted with the presidency, because he did not show that kind of particular ambition, just leadership, but not necessarily titles and things like that for himself. But as the first president, Washington's got a lot on his plate, and there's a lot, not just problems that have to be confronted as the country's president, but once again, this is an office that's brand new to the United States. There's never been a president before, and there's a lot about the president, that the framers wrote into Article 2, and there's a lot that they didn't, that Washington is going to have to kind of figure out on his own. So as the first president, Washington sets many precedents. Now, what does that word precedent mean? If we're talking about setting the precedent. Yes?
It was more important than anything else.
Maybe it might mean it's more important. It is a very important presidency, because when you're set a precedent, what do?
It's setting the stage for what?
Yeah, setting the stage for what's to come later. In other words, he's setting the standard. He's setting the mold. Because he's the first president, there are certain actions that he's going to take, or certain ways that he's going to do things, or in some cases, things that he won't do, that then become kind of the rule, that become the standard or the rule, the precedent that other presidents will follow. So there are lots of things that, the president does or doesn't do because the Constitution says so or doesn't say so. but some of it actually goes back to Washington. Now, we will mention throughout this multiple precedents that Washington's going to set. So you may want to leave yourself some space here to add some of those in later, or you can add, when we talk about it, when I mention that something is one of those big precedents that Washington is known for, you can add it in at that time. So just know we're not going to list all of the precedents that he sets right here, right now. And again, some of them are things that will last until even now, and some of them last a long time and then eventually start getting kind of eaten away or whittled away at. Some of them maybe not long at all. But, and they're in just about every matter you can think of. We're just going to talk about some of the big ones. One of the first major precedents that Washington sets is the appointment of a cabinet. This will be one of Washington's first things to do, is to appoint a cabinet. Now, in this case, a cabinet, the cabinet with a capital C, that doesn't mean like a kitchen cabinet or a storage cabinet or anything. This cabinet, we're talking about a group of advisors to the president. Okay, a group of advisors to the president. And the Constitution does say that the president can appoint, people to these executive offices, that he can consult with them. So it does kind of mention this, but it does not specifically say what those cabinet positions are. It just says the president can appoint some advisors and, give people kind of special executive positions to give him advice. So Washington kind of sets the precedent, not just in appointing a cabinet, but kind of in the particular offices that he chooses. And this will be something that presidents do. This is one of the ones that still lasts. It's always one of the big things. Whenever a new president is elected, everybody's wondering, who are they going to put in their cabinet? Who's going to be in their cabinet? So this is still around. The cabinet has grown significantly over the past 200 plus years. Washington's cabinet, his group of advisors, and they are these, executive department heads that lead certain executive departments with certain expertise. So Washington's cabinet only included 4 people. Today it is, I want to say 16 different offices, maybe 17. But anyway, Washington's cabinet only consisted of 4, and we're going to talk about 2 of them. 2 of these positions, and who held those positions, and why we talk about these 2 and not the other 2. So Washington's cabinet included a Secretary of the Treasury. So this is all just on a side note to remind you what the cabinet is, because it's something that you're probably aware of, and if you didn't know, it was called the cabinet. This is all these departments of this, that, and the other, from Department of the Treasury, all the way down to the Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Department of Education, all the way down to the Department of Homeland Security. So more of them have been added as time has gone on, but Washington's included 3 of them and the Attorney General. So Secretary of the Treasury. So what do you suppose the job of the Secretary of the Treasury is going to be? What is their sort of area of expertise? Handling the money and the finances. And we know that that's a big issue that the country is facing. And Washington chooses as his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. So we talked about Hamilton a little bit already. You've done some homework looking at him. We'll look at that a little bit more later this week. So Hamilton is the first Secretary of the Treasury. That's why he's on the $10 bill. And so his job is going to be advising Washington in the area of finances, which Hamilton, although self-taught, is extremely well-versed in, more than anybody else at the time. Knows way more about finances and banking and everything else than anybody else in the country, I'm sure. It also includes a Secretary of State, leading the Department of State or the State Department. Now, whereas Treasury is pretty easy, we look at that and we go, oh yeah, that has to do with money. People are oftentimes more confused about the State Department because we see State Department or the Department of State and we think it has something to do with the states like Alabama and Georgia, but it doesn't. The State Department deals with foreign policy. Okay, the State Department deals with foreign policy. So the Secretary of State is advising the president and working with the president on their foreign policy direction. Whereas we talked about how the president is like the chief diplomat, the Secretary of State is arguably diplomat number 2. Kind of assisting the president with that role and leading that State Department, which is kind of the foreign policy arm of the government. Yes.
Could they be like a kind of advisor?
They all are. Yes. Yes, they all are. Okay, and Washington chooses as his Secretary of State, as the first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson will serve as the first Secretary of State. We've talked about him a little bit before. What do we know about Thomas Jefferson? big thing is he's the main author of the Declaration of Independence, which at this point would not have made him quite the celebrity that it does now. But he also will serve as the first Secretary of State. Now, it also includes a Department of War. We now call that Department of Defense. And it includes what we call the Justice Department, which is the Attorney General. But we're going to talk about these two, Hamilton and Jefferson, because these are the two that Washington seeks the advice the most. And these are also two that, as some of you already know, disagree about everything to the fundamental core of their basic political philosophy. They're polar opposites about what they think. And so about what the Constitution means, about what the government ought to be doing or not doing, the power of the federal government versus that of the states, they are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so they are constantly bickering about it and advising Washington one way or the other. And so it is these debates that we want to look at and see kind of what those different political views were. And what this will eventually lead to is the beginnings of political parties in this country. So you asked about that already. And political parties, first of all, we're going to get to it in a little bit, but they don't exist yet. And they really don't start taking shape until the end of Washington's presidency. And we're going to see those differences that eventually erupt into political party differences happen right here with the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson. So, again, there's lots of things that need to be addressed, Bill of Rights, all sorts of stuff. But one of the big things that needs to be addressed is, of course, finances and the economy. Because as we know, under the Articles of Confederation, the economy and the finances were a mess. What kind of economic problems did we have under the Confederation years? Yeah. We had really bad inflation. We have huge amounts of debt. And when Hamilton is appointed as Secretary of the Treasury, he does a whole in-depth study of investigation, if you will, about what was going on in the finances, really down to the nitty-gritty. And he gives this report to Congress, this report on the public credit that's very, very negative, very doom and gloom about if we don't get our finances in order, really terrible things are going to happen. We're going to start defaulting on loans. That threatens our stability, that threatens our independence, that threatens our security. We've got to get things handled, and we've got to set ourselves on a path towards financial success and towards economic growth. And so with that report, Hamilton is then going to propose what becomes called his financial plan, Hamilton's financial plan, of how to not just, it's doing a couple of things. One, it's addressing the problem in front of them, the big thing being debt. This is a large part going to address the debt situation and pay off those debts from the revolution and all that sort of thing to get that done. But another thing that you should notice this does, Hamilton has a specific kind of vision of what kind of country he intends the United States to be, economically speaking. He kind of envisions, or very much envisions, an America with businesses, an America with banks, an America with cities, a more modern economy, more like Europe. He envisions that sort of a thing with a powerful economic structure, a powerful financial system that can aid in that, and believes that the government should be responsible for that it was the government's job to ensure that the country got on a path towards economic development, that they needed to do things and pass policies and create a climate, create a situation in which business and manufacturing, and we're not to industrialization yet, but small scale manufacturing, that all of that will be successful, that you needed to create a climate in which that was going to do well and to grow and to change. So he really saw something more modern taking place, something that not a whole lot of people saw at that time. And Hamilton's financial plan is designed to do all of that, to not only take care of the debt and face the problem they had in front of them, but to also steer them on that direction towards economic growth and towards a more modern, and what he saw as a more stable economic future that could compete with the likes of Europe and not be dependent on Europe for so many different things. So all of these things that I'm listing here, these are all parts of Hamilton's financial plan. Okay, these are all parts of it. And they each are trying to, in one way or another, accomplish those goals that I was just talking about. Okay, the first one is something called assumption, or the Assumption Bill. assumption or the assumption bill, Hamilton is proposing that the national government or the federal government, remember that's the same thing, national government or the federal government assume the state's debts. That they assume the state's debts. What do you think that means, to assume the state's debts? Like inherit them, take them on, okay? So in other words, we're going to take all the state debt, which some states have more than others, or some states that didn't have any. But we're gonna consolidate that basically. We're gonna group all that together into one big national debt, and the national government's going to pay it off. So we're not going to leave it to the individual states to pay it off. We're gonna group it all together and pay it off as a nation. Hamilton wants this because he believes that paying off that debt is crucial. That is, step number one, and it's got to be done, and it's got to be done quickly. He realizes that some of those debts have been hanging on for years and years, and states have not paid them, and he does not trust the states to pay them. He's kind of you had all this time, you haven't gotten your business together, you're threatening the financial security of the nation, so we're going to assume that all together and get it done, and get it done quick, all right? Now, that doesn't mean the states aren't paying. That doesn't mean they aren't going to be financially responsible for it. It just means they're not going to be the ones writing the check. That the United States government's going to be assigning the check instead of, individual states like New York and so forth, which is where Hamilton's from. Now, next part of the financial plan deals with partly how you pay for that. How is the national government going to get the money in order to pay off that debt? There's two ways. One is through something called tariffs. Now, I want to spend a moment on tariffs because tariffs is something you will see come up over and over and over and over again. It is always coming up every now and again. It's always a big controversy. Even next year, we talk about tariffs at the beginning, and then after a while, we don't. Tariffs are taxes on imports. Okay, taxes on imports. And what are imports? Stuff brought in, right? Okay, stuff brought in from other countries. So taxes on imports, and tariffs are, they can be more specific, and they usually are about specific imports, and the rate, it can be low or high or whatever. Hamilton wants higher tariffs, and that's kind of typical to have some kind of taxes on imports. Hamilton wants those, and he wants them to be pretty significantly high-ish anyway. Exact percentage isn't important, but he definitely wants to raise them. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. A big thing is income. If they're taxing imports, that's bringing in income for the national government. And governments need money to function. They need money to do things. They certainly need money if they want to pay off this debt that they've got here. So big reason, and probably the main reason for those tariffs at this moment, is to raise money to pay off the debt. And for a long time, tariffs were the main way that the government got income. It is not so much anymore, but for a long time, that's why tariffs, never seem to go away. But there's another purpose to tariffs, and this is not probably Hamilton's main purpose. His main thing is, bringing in income and paying off debt. This other purpose is kind of icing on the cake for Hamilton, but keep it in mind for some later administrations. Because another thing that tariffs may have the effect of doing, if you tax imports, what does that do to the price of imports? It raises them, okay? Because, by the way, the people that are going to pay tariffs is the consumer, okay? It's the consumer that's going to pay that tariff. It's not the other country that you're slapping the taxes on. That's, I think, a big misunderstanding. If you tax English goods, England ain't paying the tax. We are. But it makes the price go up. Okay, price goes up. So if the price goes up on imports, on foreign-made goods, what are people perhaps more likely to buy? They're more likely to buy local-made goods, right? More likely to buy things that are made in the United States, that are produced by American manufacturers. Now, at this point, there aren't that many manufactured goods coming out of the United States. There's not too much of that, but that's something that Hamilton would like to see change. Remember the vision of this economic future I was mentioning. Hamilton would like to see American manufacturing start to get off the ground. And once again, we're not yet to industrialization, but it's coming. And Hamilton would like to see that. And so for Hamilton, tariffs, it solves that immediate problem of debt, but it also provides some cushioning, some insulation, some protection for American businesses and American manufacturers that are trying to get off the ground. Again, that won't have an immediate effect, because there aren't that many of them. But what Hamilton is saying, let's give them a little bit of space to kind of get their foot in the door. And then that will help us later on down the line develop those businesses and develop those industries. So tariffs can also have a protective purpose. They can discourage foreign competition. And that's part of what Hamilton wants with all this as well. So it's not just about the debt, but about the hope that, American business can take off after that. Another way to pay for assumption is through something called an excise tax. An excise tax is, again, obviously, it's another tax, and it's a tax on really any kind of good you want to put it on, and it's a tax that's paid by the manufacturer. So the producer is going to pay the tax, meaning they're the ones that write the check. So it's a tax on the producer of any. You can put an excise tax on essentially anything, but Hamilton wants to put that on whiskey. So he wants an excise tax on whiskey. This would mean that the makers of whiskey are going to have to register their whiskey making stuff, their stills and all that, their apparatuses. And excise taxes are a per unit thing. You get taxed based on how much you produce. So if you produce more, you pay more, that sort of thing. It's not just a lump sum situation. Keep in mind that at this point in time, whiskey producers, you're not talking about big corporate distilleries the way you might have now. Most of the producers of whiskey are farmers. They're farmers, particularly out in the western territories that are really not territories, but even just the western parts of states, the more frontiersy part of states that are so kind of far out there in what was sort of the wilderness at the time that they really couldn't make any money off of selling their corn or their wheat as corn or wheat because it took too long to transport it. It would have gone bad by the time you got it anywhere. And so the main way that they get income is by distilling that corn or that wheat or whatever into whiskey. So that's like a main source of income for a lot of those Western farmers. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. So he thinks this is a good way to further raise funds for the government. It's an indirect way of taxing because you're not taxing the consumer exactly. They'll see part of the price increase, but it's sort of an indirect way of doing things, and something that can also maybe curb certain behaviors. All of that. Now, the crowning jewel, as Hamilton might think of it, for his financial plan. This is the one that really focuses perhaps more on the financial future of the United States rather than fixing the current problem. What Hamilton thinks is extremely important, and that Hamilton understands far better than anybody else in the United States at that time, is that Hamilton wants a national bank. He wants the creation of a national bank or a bank of the United States. Now, this can be a little difficult to describe and understand because banking is tough. Banking is a hard situation. It's a hard subject to tackle. And that's part of Hamilton's struggle that he's going to have with this, that he kind of gets it, nobody else does. But anyway, first of all, we have to understand this is not like the First National Bank or something where you could go down to a branch this afternoon and open an account. This is a government bank. Okay, it is a bank of the United States. So it is a bank where the government would deposit their money. This national bank could issue currency, issue paper money if it became necessary, and can regulate that. What else do banks do, though? Okay, banks don't just keep your money. What do? On what? What do they gather interest on? Well, savings and loans. Okay. The big thing banks are not just storage facilities where we store our money. They're businesses. Okay, they're businesses, and they make their money off of giving loans. Okay. Because they're not really giving you money with a loan, they're selling you money with a loan, that interest that they're going to earn back. And so this national bank could do that. This national bank could make loans to states or loans to foreign governments, loans to other banks. Okay, not a loan for you or me. I'm not going to go to the Bank of the United States to get a loan to buy my car, my house. But I might go to my local bank and some of their money probably might come from the national bank. But it's a centralized banking system. And again, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Banking is a complicated situation. Hamilton understands it very, very well. But he thinks this is crucial to that economic development because if you're able to get loans out there, then you're able to get money flowing. That's kind of part of the idea. Is this pumps money into the economy, capital into the economy, and that gives maybe this guy over here that wants to start a business, that gives him the ability to get a loan and start that business. So it's all about encouraging economic development and getting money out there so that things can start developing. And about having some kind of centralized control. You know, that bank could say, hey, there's too much of that going on. Let's pull it back a little bit to kind of be sort of a watchdog over the economy as well. It is not a brand new idea. Hamilton understands this very, very well, but this is modeled off of a lot of European countries, like the Bank of England, for example. So this is something that was being used in multiple European countries. Once again, Hamilton foresees a financial future in which the United States very much has an economy like those of Europe. So he wants something like that in the United States to get money out there to further regulate the economy and could possibly also make more money for the government as well. So those are the big things. We're going to pay off the debts really, really quickly. We're going to assume state debts into one national debt. We're going to do that by establishing tariffs and the excise tax. That's how we'll fund that debt. And then also, you know, Hamilton sees part of that as kind of an icing on the cake that will go in a particular direction with all of that. And then a national bank to further economic development and to further the nation's economy. So Hamilton proposes all of this. He, of course, wants all of it, thinks it's great. But one person that will not, of course, is Jefferson. Jefferson's going to hate and despise every single bit of this. What we want to do next is take a look as to why. So before we talk about it here, we're going to investigate why Jefferson thinks some things, exactly what he thinks, and a little bit more about exactly what Hamilton thinks. So we're going to come back to this shortly. So we're not totally done with it yet, but we're going to break from it for now. So what I want you to do next, hold on just a second.